Miranda's voice arrived in my living room as a reflection tidy, measured, already concluded. Your role doesn't align with our structure. 7 minutes later, the screen went black and showed me back to myself. A tired man in a quiet home office, hands folded like I'd rehearsed this calm. I noted the transition steps, thanked her, logged off. Professional to the end. That was the last official sentence of a 12-year chapter. I turned to the contract I already knew by heart. The non-compete sat there like a locked door with a loose hinge, sloppy cross-references, overbroad definitions that undermined themselves. Someone had trusted templates and momentum more than language. Titan Energy Holdings had bought EmberCore Systems, and with it, the illusion that no one would read the fine print twice. I read it 4 times. Then I started marking the margins. My phone pulsed on the desk. Evan again. Then 2 other engineers, each message a different note in the same chord. You were right. They're gutting the pipeline. Are you still thinking about the project? I let the screen dim without answering. Timing mattered. In war stories and in product launches, the first move is not always the bravest one. Sometimes it's the quiet one. The acquisition had played like a parade. Press releases draped in words like synergy and vision. Titan spoke of minimal disruption, promising to cherish the team that built our reputation. I heard the echo of applause and thought of the first servers we racked by hand, the nights the fans hummed like lullabies, the moments a line of code turned into a remedy for a customer's sleeplessness. Every system, every process, we had fingerprints in the solder and the comments. That kind of history doesn't fit into a slide deck. I opened my laptop and the plan I'd been shaping in the margins of uncertainty. Not because I predicted the door would close this way, but because the room had already started to feel unfamiliar. Quarterly numbers had become our weather. Forecasts eclipsed first principles. I watched product roadmaps drift toward what could be counted, not what could be solved. So I began sketching. Careful. Legal. Mine. In the kitchen, the coffee machine sighed awake. On the whiteboard above the table, I'd listed 3 columns. Clients, pain points, proofs. Names that trusted us when we were an 11-person roomer in a warehouse. Next to them, a smaller list in a tighter hand. 5 engineers who had learned to think past the brief. People who had reached out in the last week, asking what came next. I hadn't answered, not yet. I stood there with the mug warming my hands and felt something steadier than anger rise to the surface. Not defiance, not revenge, a kind of fidelity to the work, to the customers who measured success in uptime and sleep, to the version of myself that stayed late because the fix was almost there. Miranda's call ended a job. It didn't end an obligation. I turned back to the board, erased a line, wrote a better one. Then I wrote 2 more. We began inside a warehouse that smelled like sawdust and ambition. 11 of us, folding tables for desks, a coffee pot that rattled when it boiled. Gerald Whitman walked the aisles between our makeshift stations with a kind of reverence, tapping a chassis here, a diagram there, asking questions that sounded like invitations. He didn't pitch vision, he practiced it. Let's build the tool that keeps the lights honest, he'd say, and we would nod because the sentence felt plain and noble. I built our first viable stack out of stubbornness and borrowed parts. 80-hour weeks were not a badge, they were a bridge. On the other side lived the thing we owed to customers who ran factories at dawn and hospitals through storms. At home, space narrowed. My wife counted dinners missed like silent beads on a string. I kept promising after this sprint, as if time were a rope I could knot and climb back down. She was right. I wore EmberCore like a second skin. We loved each other, but love has calories, and I was starving it. The night we ended, there were no villains in the room, only a ledger of small abandonments. I kept the couch, she kept the softest mugs. We divided books by dog ears. Years later, Gerald got sick. The office color shifted. Logan, his son with a pedigree that sounded impressive in investor decks, stepped in with tidy slides and sharper suits. The strategy meetings grew fluorescent, bright, and cold. Innovation became a line item. Wins were quartered into KPIs. Our Monday stand-ups changed their grammar. Less why, more when. Less architecture, more optics. I told myself it was a phase. Then I told myself it was a test. Then I stopped telling myself anything and watched. The day I overheard my department labeled redundant, I stood outside the conference room with a paper cup growing soft in my hand. Titan's executives spoke in future perfect. By Q3, these teams will have been integrated. Phrases that move past tense before the work begins. I finished my coffee and took the long way back to my desk. Engineers live by constraints. Give me a wall and I will find its door. That night, I found mine. I started sketching Summit Dynamics in a notebook I never brought to the office. Not a rebellion. A contingency with a conscience. Strip out EmberCore's proprietary elements. Keep the principles the ones that saved clients money not by slogans, but by kilowatt hours. I wrote with rules at the top of every page. Build clean. Build lawful. Build what matters. Between lists of modules and latency targets, I scribbled other reminders. People over politics. Decisions over decks. Uptime is dignity. Logan called all hands to celebrate a potential acquisition and spoke about shareholder clarity. I looked around the room at the faces that had carried us on too little sleep and too much grit. They applauded because that is what you do in companies. Later, alone, I placed the notebook on my kitchen table and drew the first page of our alternative. A system with no slide for synergy, only a demo that works. The weeks before the cut felt like a room dimming one bulb at a time. Calendar invites thinned. Strategy threads skipped my name. Miranda scheduled one-on-ones with every department head but left my square on the org chart untouched, like a chair no one mentions at dinner. I kept building. I reviewed pull requests, drew diagrams on whiteboards I now mostly erased myself, and wrote documentation that spoke to whoever would inherit the bones. If dignity is a muscle, this was how I lifted. 2 days before the end, Miranda pinged me with a cordial line. Could you share historical roadmaps and archive access? I gave her everything, indexes, notes, explainer videos I'd recorded at 2 a.m. For future engineers, I imagined would be curious and kind. I wrote my last handover comment as if the next person deserved the best of me, because the work did. She replied with a thank you and a calendar hold I already understood. That evening, I texted Evan, dinner, tomorrow, 7. He arrived with 4 others, the room warm with the smell of takeout and the quiet panic of people who've seen the future and don't like the shape of it. We spoke in low tones that felt like a pact. No drama, only plans. We drew a boundary around what we would not do, no copying, no ghosts from EmberCore's repositories. Then we named what we would. Reimagine the architecture from first principles. Let outcomes, not optics, set the tempo. We ate standing up, circling a whiteboard until the markers bled. A week later, Titan's new leadership called a company-wide presentation in the auditorium where we used to demo breakthroughs that felt like birthdays. Miranda stood under a screen crowded with arrows and boxes, the kind of diagram that sells more than it solves. 18 months, she said, to phase EmberCore's systems into Titan's enterprise architecture. I knew that architecture like an old textbook sound in theory, 3 years behind in practice. It could not breathe with the mess and marvel of modern grids. Around me, engineers lowered their eyes to notebooks. Some nodded because nodding is cheaper than questions. I counted the people who looked up and didn't nod my map of quiet allies. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't challenge the slide about economies of scale. I took notes on where the real fractures would appear. Telemetry, saturation, edge site latency, the way custom reporting would suffocate under a monolith. Afterward, I walked to the parking garage and sat in my car with the engine off. The silence made a clean room. I thought about the first prototype Gerald and I had coaxed into life. About customers who called our support line and used our first names because we had earned that familiarity one fix at a time. This wasn't grief for a job. It was grief for a language we had taught machines to speak with, care about power, about time, about trust now being translated into slogans. I promised myself one thing before the key turned. We would build in the open air again, even if we started with nothing but a table, 5 chairs, and the truth. I created the group at 113A. When the neighborhood was a hive of refrigerators and distant trains. Summit Core, I named it, a private room behind a locked door. 5 invitations. 5 read receipts that pulsed into green. I posted the first rule before anyone typed a word. We build from memory, not from theft. Evan added the second. We design like we might have to defend it in court. The third came from Lila, our best systems engineer. We owe the customer more than we owe our egos. A small creed, enough to stand under. For 3 weeks, we met after day jobs and polite smiles. My living room turned workshop. Laptops on the dining table, cables like vines, pizza boxes stacked like soft bricks near the sink. We drew on glass panes and butcher paper, turning the walls into a tide of ideas. We mapped Titan's blind spots where their monolith would choke on telemetry, where their batch jobs would slip behind real time, how their reporting veneer would fracture over bespoke regulatory demands. We didn't gloat, we documented. Every claim paired with a test. Every test paired with a plan. Between sprints, I kept a separate notebook labeled guardrails. A lawyer's voice penciled in the margins. No reuse of EmberCore code. No derivative materials from archived repos. Fresh architecture. New models. Cleanroom diagrams. I spoke with Eleanor Winslow, who read our non-compete as if dissecting a clock. She pointed to the clause that overreached, the definition that contradicted itself, the spaces we could inhabit without apology. We tightened our plans until even our fears had nowhere to hide. On the 4th night, we listed clients who would feel Titan's weight first. Manufacturers with lean margins, utilities with complex reporting, hospitals that cannot afford a blink. We built a matrix of pain points and response windows, and beside it, proof benchmarks from a stubbed prototype Evan had coaxed into humming on my kitchen counter. We watched graphs curve toward what we knew was possible, modest and undeniable. I registered the company before dawn on a Tuesday, Summit Dynamics, LLC. The name felt like a promise whispered to a mountain. I signed a lease for 2 small rooms over a yoga studio, floors that creaked and windows that opened to real air. We bought a server rack that we assembled ourselves, laughing at the way old rituals make new ground feel sacred. I wired the deposit from my severance as if redeeming it from a mistaken account. That same afternoon, a message from Logan slid into my inbox. Heard, you might be starting something. Let's talk before you do anything hasty. I stared at the screen until the cursor seemed to breathe. Then I closed the window. If he wanted to negotiate with the past, he could do it without me. The night before the leap, I wrote a single sentence to the group. If we're going to do this, let's do it all the way. Morning brought 5 resignations, each written in the careful tone of people who still believe in being decent. By noon, we had keys to a door with our name on it. By evening, we had a plan you could feel without a slide. Our first win arrived without a trumpet. Riverton Manufacturing, a mid-size plant with floors that hum and margins that breathe shallow. I knew their boilers by sound, their night shift foreman by the way he said my name. We walked in with a demo that didn't promise the moon, only steady daylight. Built on principles we forged at EmberCore, but rewritten clean, fresh interfaces, leaner data paths, reporting that fit their regulators like a tailored sleeve. Marcus Alvarez listened, asked 2 hard questions, then nodded once. He signed before lunch, a tidy signature that steadied our hands. For an hour, the room felt taller. We let ourselves picture a corridor of doors opening like a rhythm we could keep. Then the courier arrived with the envelope that wore its weight. Titan's letter alleged the predictable: breach of non-compete, theft by implication, a list of immediate remedies that read like a script for surrender. I read it twice, then a 3rd time out loud so fear could hear its own echo and shrink from it. Eleanor Winslow met me over takeout cartons littered with red chopstick sleeves. She turned the pages with a surgeon's calm. Overbroad, self-defeating in places, she said, tapping a clause that misdefined the very market it sought to fence. Your architecture is independent. Your documentation is clean room. Their case is pressure, not proof. She drafted our reply with sentences you could rest a glass on. We sent it before midnight. The next day, Miranda called me into a glass room where the city glittered like an argument for compliance. She didn't circle the point. Come back as a consultant, she said, voice smooth as a lobby. 2 years. Strong compensation. Help us transition. The word help had a soft edge and a steel core. I saw the shape of the cage. Bind my time, freeze our momentum, turn our threat into footnote. I stood, thanked her for the courtesy, and said no. It was not defiance. It was alignment. Titan did not wait to be gracious. Their account managers rang Riverton and 2 other prospects we had warmed with careful demos. They spoke of audits and maintenance agreements, of risks that sound expensive even when they're not real. Marcus called me, frustration leaking through his professionalism. "They're hinting at voiding support if we proceed," he said. "I can't gamble production on a feud." By morning, 3 doors that had been ajar swung shut with polite regrets. Our runway collapsed from months to weeks, numbers on a spreadsheet turning into the air in our lungs. The team gathered in our 2-room office, shoulders tight, eyes bright in the way of people who know they're being watched by a storm. I told the truth. "They hit us where we're soft," I said. "Good. Now we know the ground." I thought of Riverton's brief yes, of the quiet competence in our code base, of the way a small crew can turn a tide if they keep their strokes even. That night, after the lights went out, the servers still whispered. We hadn't lost the thing that mattered. We still knew how to make a system hold. The message from Gerald showed up like a lighthouse flash, brief, steady, unmistakable. Dustin, he would have called me once, but names change with chapters. Nolan, he wrote now. They didn't just buy EmberCore's code. They bought its liabilities. Call me. We met at his lake house before sunrise. Water flat as a held breath, the dock creaking like an old friend remembering our wait. He moved slower than the man who used to pace our warehouse, but his eyes kept their voltage. Inside, he spread folders across the dining table, each tab a history I thought I'd filed under done. "Titan thinks they acquired technology," he said, "but what they needed were contracts, one in particular." He tapped a blue tab, Horizon Grid Authority. My chest tightened in a way coffee can't touch. Horizon wasn't a logo to me. It was 4 years of building a custom nervous system for a utility spanning 3 states, every alert tuned, every report aligned to regulators who didn't tolerate poetry. "They promised Horizon a seamless migration," Gerald went on, "to Titan's standard stack, 6 months." He slid a printed email, names redacted, timelines not. I read the schedule and felt an old engineer's reflex push back. "You can't compress physics with optimism." Next page. "Customizations to be standardized where feasible." I knew those customizations by name because we had named them only after they earned it. "Here's the part you didn't know," he said, and the room cooled. "The contract I negotiated with Horizon includes punitive guarantees, 99% uptime with escalating penalties. It's not marketing. It's signed law between companies." I remembered the weeks we'd slept at the office to hit that number, the night a storm took down a substation and our system rerouted around failure like it had learned mercy. The clause wasn't bravado. It was a promise we bled for. He flipped to another document, a board memo forwarded by someone who still believed in what Gerald built. Titan's plan rested on efficiencies gained by unifying architecture, with a footnote I could not unsee: exposure, manageable. Legacy team redundant post-integration. The tone of people who think complexity is a costume, not a body. "Why help us?" I asked. "Because debts are filaments, and I wanted to see how this one glowed." He looked toward the lake, where morning had started to color the water. "They shorted the final payment," he said quietly. "Integration costbacks," language Logan didn't catch. "We took 60 cents on the dollar for a life's work. My son thinks Titan is grooming him. They're grooming a narrative." He didn't add the rest. "Disappointment is a private weather." I drove back with the folders seat-belted beside me, the weight of a pattern settling in, acquire relationships, milk the headlines, grind the edges down until the fit is easy for the acquirer and expensive for everyone else. Fire the inconvenient, rename the work, declare victory. Call it scale, as if scale were a synonym for care. At a red light, I texted Evan, 7 a.m. tomorrow. New target, bring everything on Horizon's grid. He replied with a single checkmark. We weren't going to storm a castle. We were going to be the bridge that appears when the castle forgets its drawbridge matters. We set the clock for 8 weeks and treated time like a tool, not a threat. Mornings began before sun, coffee passing like a relay baton. Evenings dissolved into whiteboard dust and code reviews that sounded like prayer, short, precise, patient. We built toward a single premise. Horizon Grid Authority could not afford a stumble, and Titan's plan was a staircase missing steps. Our job was to bring a solid stare in the dark and say quietly, "Here." We started with interfaces. No heroics. Just adapters that honored the quirks we remembered from 4 long years, telemetry streams that swelled at shift change, meters that lied politely in winter, regulators who wanted their reports not beautiful, only exact. We designed a translation layer that didn't bully the data into shape, it listened. Then we wrote the core services again, cleaner than the first time because loss is a great editor. Every module signed its name to a test. Every test signed its name to a log. I kept distance from Horizon like a necessary kindness. No emails, no calls. Titan would be watching, and I refused to hand them a narrative. Instead, we built capacity. We hired one more developer on a contract, a quiet genius who tuned latency the way a luthier tunes wood. We documented, like we'd be audited by someone with no patience for excuses. Every diagram dated, every decision reasoned and reversible. Gerald took the role the industry had already given him, elder statesman with a question in his pocket. At conferences and panels, he stood up and asked about forced migrations in critical infrastructure. He did not say Titan. He did not say Horizon. He said, "What fails when we pretend custom is vanity?" Then he sat down and let the room make its own connections. Week 5. The first crack. Horizon's eastern substations dropped to partial visibility for several hours. Social posts called it expected transition turbulence, but our back channel heard what the press did not. Misaligned data schemas, a queue that backed up until alarms slept through their own ringing. We added a note to our dossier, not gloating, evidence. 2 weeks later, the second phase cutover widened into absence. A 4-hour reporting blackout across a service region. Not catastrophic, not yet, but enough to wake regulators, enough to stain dashboards. Horizon issued a notice of deficiency to Titan, the contract's teeth finally biting. Penalties began to tick like a metronome. Titan responded with the move we had predicted. Blame the legacy architecture they'd acquired, the way a clumsy dancer blames the floor. That night, we pivoted from preparation to positioning. I drafted a brief that walked like an engineer and spoke like a lawyer. Side-by-side traces, before and after latencies. A table of edge conditions we had solved at EmberCore and retained at Summit as principles, not code. The conclusion was a line even a tired board could read. The failures weren't born in the past. They were injected by an incompatible future. Gerald volunteered to deliver it. "Let me be the messenger," he said. "They'll hear me." I watched him drive away with a thin folder that could alter the weather. In the office, Evan dimmed the lights and ran another end-to-end test. The graphs held steady, small hills in a calm landscape. We did not celebrate. We let the quiet settle around the thing we were becoming. Ready. The invitation landed like a single chime. Coffee tomorrow. 2 p.m. West Side Roasters. A. M. No logo, just the initials. I arrived early and chose a corner booth where sunlight made a small rectangle of honesty on the table. Dr. Aisha Morgan was already there, shoulders straight, eyes that had learned to separate signal from noise. She didn't waste our first 10 seconds on pleasantries. "Your brief," she said softly, "aligns with what my team is seeing. Titan keeps saying, standardize, but our grid isn't a slogan. It's a body. Every artery has a reason." I nodded, keeping my hands open on the table like I had nothing to hide because I didn't. "We wrote that analysis from memory and public artifacts," I said. "No EmberCore code. Principles only. We learned the lessons once. We just refused to pretend we didn't." She looked past me for a slow moment, collecting a question she wouldn't let be blunt. "Do we have options?" I met the question with the narrow truth that leaves room for error. "You have one that avoids a cliff. A rapid deployment. 3 weeks. Our platform relearns your shape instead of forcing you into ours. 0 regulatory interruption if we start with the reporting spine and expand outward. We built for that order." I slid 2 drives across the wood. The first, a technical overview with diagrams that didn't perform, just explained. The second, Eleanor's legal memo, our non-compete parsed into bones and tendons. "Your counsel will want this," I said. "We're clean." Titan's letter leans on intimidation, not enforceable scope. Aisha didn't touch the drives right away. "If we move," she said, "we trigger a storm." I smiled, because storms are only weather if you're prepared. Then we bring umbrellas and maps. Tennis finger. She pocketed the drives like they were ordinary. Then she stood, shook my hand with a pressure that said provisional trust, and left without looking back. The room filled again with steam, grinders, small talk. I sat a minute longer to let my pulse fall to idle. 2 days later, Titan announced an emergency stabilization at Horizon language that translates to pause the bleeding while we look for gauze. Their stock shed 8% by close. We added the public notice to our dossier, a line that proved the arc we'd traced on our wall. That evening, an RFP arrived from Horizon, stamped with emergency provisions that allowed for bypassing normal ceremony. The subject line was simple: Immediate Services Proposal Summit Dynamics. I called everyone to the office. We didn't whoop or high-five. We drew a rectangle on the board labeled Monday and broke the next 72 hours into small, solvable hours. Evan assigned modules with a finger steady as a surgeon's. Lila carved out testing as if she were building a tunnel in rock. I wrote until words turned lean and clear. Scope, milestones, rollback plans, guarantees we would sign with sleep and weekends, if we had to. Before midnight, I stepped into the hallway that smelled faintly of incense from the studio below. I thought of Miranda's slides, of Gerald's folders, of Riverton's brief yes and the threat that chased it. I sent our proposal with a single sentence at the top: "We will not let your lights lie." Then I turned off the gallery lights and let the servers hum their quiet promise. Horizon's board met at 10 on a Thursday. At 10:43, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. "Unanimous," Aisha said, voice lowered but unshaking. "Expedited execution. We need you to begin Monday." I let the word settle like a stone in a bowl of water, ripples spreading to every tired hour we had stacked. Within an hour, Eleanor confirmed the contract. Clean indemnification, no traps hidden in definitions, an emergency provision that acknowledged the stakes without melodrama. I forwarded the final PDF to the team with one line: "We have our bridge." By mid-afternoon, the industry knew. Titan's stock slumped again, a public flinch. Their legal team moved like gravity, swift, predictable. An emergency injunction request landed in our inbox before dusk. Blocks Summit from executing the Horizon contract on grounds of non-compete breach and irreparable harm. The hearing was set for Monday morning, the same hour we planned to plug into Horizon's spine. We arrived at the courthouse early, carrying canvas bags stuffed with binders that were less show than shield. Titan came heavy, 4 attorneys in blue suits, their chief counsel in front, and behind them, Miranda with a face composed into corporate serenity. I nodded to her like you do to a former neighbor who chose a different street. She didn't nod back. The judge read quickly, questions crisp as nails. Titan's counsel spoke of proximity of expertise, of indistinguishable innovation, of threats to equitable transition. Eleanor waited, then stood with the quiet confidence of someone who believes sentences should earn their verbs. She pointed to our architectural affidavits: independent design, dated diagrams, clean room protocols. She pointed to Horizon's filing: public interest, regulatory continuity, the cost of delay measured not in headlines but in hospitals, plants, homes. The judge leaned back and looked over her glasses. Your non-compete, as written, limits the use of proprietary systems. I see no persuasive evidence of such use, she said to Titan, and the public interest in uninterrupted utility service outweighs speculative harm. Her ruling was a handful of sentences, spare and firm. Injunction denied. In the hallway, Miranda intercepted me, voice low, smile practiced. This isn't over, she said. Titan doesn't lose. I met the place in her gaze where certainty lives and sometimes fools us. This was never about losing, I said. It's about making something that holds. I walked to where my crew waited, their faces washed in the strange light of relief and responsibility at once. We didn't celebrate. We bought coffees and went straight to the office. The weekend became a narrow bridge we crossed one step at a time. Evan tuned adapters until they breathed with Horizon's cadence. Lila set fail-safes like handrails every few feet. I rewrote a migration checklist 3 times until it read like a recipe anyone could follow at 3 a.m. if they had to. Monday, 7:58 a.m. The room was so quiet, I could hear the server fans counting seconds. At 8, we connected. No fanfare. Just one subsystem, then another, a sequence of green that felt like dawn arriving to rooms that needed it. Aisha texted a single word, stable, then another, thanks. I exhaled a breath I'd been carrying since the Zoom that ended my old life. We weren't winning, we were working, and work, done right, is its own verdict. 18 months later, our floor in the old brick building felt like a pulse. 27 people now, names on glass doors, bikes leaning against hallways, a fridge full of mismatched lunches labeled in careful handwriting. Horizon's rollout had finished ahead of schedule with no service interruptions. The graphs we watched for months kept their quiet, confident slope. Word traveled the way good work always has between operators on graveyard shifts, between compliance officers who trade war stories, between CTOs who meet in the back row of conferences and say, "Who solved it for you?" 4 more migrations followed, not as conquests, but as careful crossings over water that used to look too rough. Titan folded their lawsuits back into filing cabinets and redirected their attention to triage. A memo reached us secondhand. Resources refocused, reputational containment prioritized. I felt nothing sharp, only a cooling of heat I no longer needed. Miranda was reassigned to a distant subsidiary. Logan left for a venture incubator, the kind that promises the past a fresh haircut. Gerald came by some Fridays with a bag of oranges and a story about the old days that always ended in a question. He never asked for a desk, only a chair by the window where the mountains made their quiet case for patience. On the 2nd anniversary of my dismissal, an email arrived from my first boss at EmberCore, the one who'd taken a risk on an impatient engineer. "You built something better than we deserved back then," he wrote. "Some victories arrive on a slow train." I stared at the lines until they blurred into something larger than they were. Not validation, recognition, the kind that doesn't try to own you. We gathered in the conference room that evening to toast a new module small to the world, essential to a hospital that couldn't afford an hour of guessing. We clinked glasses made of paper because we still lived within our means. Lila laughed. Evan rolled a marker between his fingers like a coin he was deciding where to spend. I looked around at faces that had chosen difficulty over comfort, clarity over noise. Partners, not merely colleagues. None of us were owed this room. We had chosen it together, one careful decision at a time. Later, at home, I stood on the deck while the mountains gathered sunset, the way elders gather stories slowly, with care for the edges. The bitterness that once sat in my mouth like a coin had dissolved into something gentler. Gratitude, yes, but also understanding. Without Titan's certainty, without Miranda's tidy dismissal, Summit might have stayed a sketch in a notebook. I didn't reclaim a career so much as find the road under my feet that had always been there, waiting for me to trust it. Sometimes the push out of the wrong room is the door to the right one. Sometimes the most faithful act is to keep building when someone says the building is over. I watched a last strip of orange fall behind the range and thought, not triumph, not revenge, only this. We made something that holds.